1700 years ago, an Egyptian scribe slowly copied out the text of the New Testament. Until 1931, this manuscript lay under the dry, drifting sands of Egypt. Dug up and studied by scholars, this text has become one of our earliest sources of the New Testament. To find out more about the fascinating story of the Bible, stay tuned to Science in Action.
Newspapers about two new translations of the Bible. Now, one was by Protestant scholars in England, and the other by Catholic scholars in the United States. One of these translations is already on the bestseller list. We have asked a distinguished archaeologist and biblical scholar to tell us about the significance of these new English versions and about the sources from which the text of the Bible comes. He is director of the Palestine Institute and professor of New Testament at the Pacific School of Religion. He's also pastor of the University Christian Church in Berkeley. It's my pleasure to welcome back once again Dr. Jack Finnegan. Jack, how have you been?
Just fine, Earl. I'm delighted to be your guest again.
Well, please sit down here and let me tell you about my problem. I'm slightly more than confused, in trying to find out about all the things we're going to talk about. I discovered that we have many different kinds of Bibles, and we have just a few of them here on the table in front of us. In fact, running down from this side over here, we have two of the authorized version. We have the Douay version, the Revised Standard, the Confraternity, the New English, and the Berkeley, just to mention a few, and I gather there are several others, and this is all very confusing to one who doesn't know much about this.
Oh, I think that's understandable enough, Earl. I imagine most people are somewhat confused by having so many different versions and translations. Actually, of course, there are many good reasons for this. Perhaps we could get at it best if we went back a few minutes to the exciting story of ancient biblical manuscripts.
Now, I remember the last time that you visited us on Science in Action, you told us about the discovery of the oldest, or I should say the earliest of Old Testament manuscripts found in a cave on the deserted shores of the Red Sea. And as I remember it, these Dead Sea Scrolls gave us our earliest Old Testament manuscripts, but am I correct now that none of these were New Testament manuscripts?
Yes, that is correct. The Dead Sea Scrolls were written before the time of Jesus, or possibly within his lifetime, and of course none of the New Testament manuscripts had been written at all by then. So the problem of recovering the ancient New Testament manuscripts is somewhat different. Particularly, we could say that the oldest New Testament manuscripts come from Egypt instead of Palestine. They happen to be written on codexes instead of scrolls. They are in Greek instead of in Hebrew. And mostly they are, in the earliest examples, written on papyrus instead of on leather.
And Jack, you've covered a great deal of material. Could we go back to the first of those points and start through them again?
Well, why don't we take up the last point, maybe, the matter of the writing material. You'll remember the Dead Sea Scrolls were written on leather, and they were in the form of a roll. Here, for example, is one now that is on leather and that is in the form of a roll. We have some rolls from ancient times that are as long as 133 feet. But for an ordinary book in New Testament times, a scroll of, say, 30 or 35 feet sufficed, and it was perhaps 10 inches high, and when it was rolled up, an inch or an inch and a half in diameter. These scrolls were also made out of papyrus, of course, as well as out of leather, and this is a papyrus scroll now, before it was unrolled for study.
I'm interested in how these letters are made. Are they made with a pen to use ink, or are there special materials for this?
To answer that question, we might look at a stone carving from ancient Egypt that actually shows some scribes. See how they are holding in their left hand papyrus scrolls, and in the right hand, if you look closely, pens. So from that, why, we know something about their methods of writing.
Jack, we have some of these raw materials over here, and I think if you could demonstrate for us just how this was done, it would be very helpful.
As far as the pen is concerned, it seems that they used a reed of this sort, and they sharpened the point of it here and split it, probably much like our old-fashioned quill pens. Then, as to the ink, we know that they made ink out of lampblack and gum and water. They made another kind out of nut galls and green vitriol and water. The first made a permanent black. The second turned a handsome rusty brown color in the course of time. Now suppose we take one of our pens here that has been put into the sort of a holder that they used and see whether it will write for us also.
Good.
We'll take a piece of our papyrus material and see if we can actually write on this with the ancient pen. Yes, it's beginning to work all right, isn't it?
Quite frankly, that looks like Greek to me.
Well, without going too far with it here for an example, I guess I'll just stop and say that you are quite right, that that's Greek to me, and it's Greek to anybody. That actually is Greek.
I didn't realize that.
Now you see, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. So if we were to write up one of the Hebrew words for an example, we might have something like this. Now that is the way the Old Testament opens. That says, in the beginning. That's Hebrew. Jesus probably spoke in Aramaic. In his time, that was the everyday language, we think. Then in the Mediterranean world, the everyday language and also the literary language was Greek. Accordingly, we might see what this would look like if we wrote it in Greek. There we have those that same phrase, in the beginning, written in Greek, NRK. Now, you might like to see what the writing looks like as an ancient scribe himself actually did it.
That looks very difficult. It all seems to run together. How do you decipher the words, or how do you tell them apart?
Actually, they ran the words right together, but it isn't as bad as you'd think. Why don't you try an English passage that has been set up in this same style?
Let's see. Paulo Servanto. No. Paul, a servant of Jesus. Oh, I see.
Yes, you're getting started all right. And if we read it all the way through, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of God, which he promised afore through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. That's the way Paul began his letter to the Romans, and it just takes a little practice, and you can do it all right.
Jack, earlier you mentioned something about abbreviations being used by these early scribes. I didn't realize that abbreviations went back that far.
Yes, in the very earliest New Testament manuscripts we found there are abbreviations. Let me show you how those go. Take the word for Lord, which is a frequent and familiar word in the New Testament. That's Kyrios. The abbreviation is made by taking the first letter, kappa, and the last letter, sigma, drawing a line over the top. Or if we take the name of Jesus, this one, we take the first letter and the last, or possibly the first letter, the second letter, and the last letter, and draw the line over the top, and that's the abbreviation.
The scrolls are quite familiar to us. I mean, we've all seen scrolls, but the codex, the word codex is a different kind of a term, not as used as much.
Well, the codex is just a book. Now, a pile of papyrus leaves might be taken and pasted together and made into a long strip like this and rolled up. That would give us for a scroll.
Yes.
Or we can lay these sheets of papyrus one on top of the other till we have a whole stack of them, and then fold them in the middle and make a quire in this fashion, and possibly make other folds and lay them together and bind them, and that gives us a book with leaves and pages that you can number and turn through just as in a modern book.
And Jack, I was looking at this fragment of the codex that you brought over to the program.
This shows how these codexes often come to us in such dilapidated condition, sometimes virtually intact, sometimes no more than this. This one we have in the museum at the Palestine Institute, and it's from the 4th century. Then there's another one that's from about 125 AD and is the oldest fragment of the New Testament in existence as far as we know. It's also a part of John.
Now, we hear about these new translations. I wanted to ask you about the old translations. Why aren't they just as good as they used to be?
The best way to answer that question would be to make a swift survey of the antecedents of our modern English versions. We could start that out by looking at a familiar passage. Let's take 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Most people know this in the version that begins, "Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels." Now here is the Chester Beatty Papyrus, which is a collection of Paul's letters written in Greek on a papyrus codex from AD 200. This is our oldest copy. Here is a page of the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians. If I may point out, at the top is the page number, 105. Then if I may try to read this off fairly literally from the Greek, and if I have prophecy, and if I know all mysteries, and all knowledge, and if I have all faith, so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. And if I give all of my possessions, and if I give over my body in order to make a boast about it, but do not have love, it profits me nothing. Love suffers long and is kind. It might be interesting to point out here that at the end of the third line, the scribe ran out of room and had to leave off the last letter of the word. He made one of our abbreviation marks to show that he had done it. Down here, he divided the Greek word agape, which means love, right in the middle without any mark, just like that you were trying to read a while ago. In this word, this letter in later manuscripts is changed, a single letter, but it changes the meaning completely from this text, which says, give my body in order to make a boast of it, to give my body to be burned.
A matter of interpretation, then, as to how this should be phrased in any translation.
Precisely. That's why we have to study the many manuscripts and compare them to get the text as accurately as possible.
Well, then, following these early manuscripts, what were the first translations that were made?
Probably Latin, first of all, and in the 4th century, Jerome made the great translation that is known as the Vulgate. There had been earlier Latin translations, and he partly used those and partly made his own translation. Here is our passage that we were just looking at in Greek as it was translated in the Vulgate into Latin. I might call attention to the last line, Caritas patiens est benigna est. Caritas is Greek for charity, and that's where charity comes from in this passage. And then it says that charity is patient and it is benign.
We've had Greek and we've had Latin, and I'm not a scholar of either, so I'll have to have something else.
Well, you might want English, is that right?
That would be helpful.
And so we might come to the English translations. There were some into Anglo-Saxon, and then the important one, first of all, was by Wycliffe in the 14th century. Here we have our same passage, and it begins, and if I have prophecy and know all mysteries and all cunning. Down at the end, it has reproduced the Vulgate Latin exactly, hasn't it? Because it says, charity is patient, it is benign.
Now, as a biblical scholar, what would you prefer? Would you prefer a translation from a good translation, or would you rather go back to the original and make your own interpretation?
Naturally back to the original. That is what our next English version did, in fact. Tyndale, 150 years later, went back to the Greek and Hebrew manuscripts. If we look at this same passage in Tyndale's version, we might notice for just one interesting point that in place of charity, he has now introduced the word we would be more apt to use in modern English, the word love, as the translation of the Greek agape. Now, there were other translations, of course, besides this, the Great Bible and the Breeches Bible and so on, but this always remained. Oh, that in the Breeches Bible, the reason they came to call it that was when they translated the story of the Garden of Eden. They said in this translation that Adam and Eve sewed fig leaves and made breeches or trousers for themselves.
And it's carried the name of that since then.
Yes.
You know, in looking at these next two, I noticed that they came out within 1 year of each other. 1610 on this, and then coming over to the next, 1611 on this one.
Right. These are respectively the Catholic and the Protestant versions of that period. A group of Roman Catholic scholars published in its completed form the Douay version in 1610. As far as our New Testament passage is concerned, we see that it reads in a very straightforward way, and that it ends up in a fashion that's directly derived from the Vulgate, of which it was a translation, saying charity is patient, is kind.
And then 1 year later, the King James Version.
This was made by a committee of scholars in England who were authorized to do the work under the sponsorship of King James I of England. Accordingly, we call it either the Authorized Version or the King James Version. Here we find the stately, beautiful language to which many of us are most accustomed, as for example here in the middle of the passage. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. Now after this, of course, there were more manuscript discoveries, and that changed the picture then for future work too.
Now, what kind of manuscripts were these? Were they scrolls, or were they as papyrus, or other materials?
Well, they were, in some cases, papyrus materials found beneath the dry sands of Egypt where they had been for a long, long time. In other cases, they were parchments which had been hidden in ancient monasteries for many centuries. Some were scrolls. Mostly these were also in the codex form.
You were mentioning earlier about one that was of considerable interest.
One of these monasteries that I wanted to mention was the monastery out in Mount Sinai, from which we have Codex Sinaiticus. Out there was this monastery that was at the foot of Mount Sinai, and Constantine Tischendorf, a great German scholar, was out there in 1844. He saw a pile of manuscripts, some of which were being burned because they thought they were of no value. But he recognized that some ancient writing was there, and he recovered an ancient manuscript that's one of our most important ones, dating from the middle of the 4th century and containing virtually the entire Old Testament and New Testament. You might like to see the way it looked before it was bound, when it was just a pile of parchment leaves. And then you might like to see a page of it and see the fine, clear writing.
Well, then, this book that we have here, am I correct in understanding that this is a facsimile?
This is a fine edition, not strictly speaking a facsimile. Codex Sinaiticus was given to the Tsar of Russia, who had sponsored the work of Tischendorf, and he caused the manuscript to be edited like this and published. They even made special type to reproduce the Greek writing.
Certainly a very, very beautiful thing. I've noticed the binding here and the printing. It is quite valuable.
Yes, we consider this one of our most valuable volumes. It's, of course, not nearly as valuable as the original manuscript, which was acquired by the British Museum in 1933 for $500,000.
As a biblical scholar, just how important is this?
Very. This is one of our most dependable manuscripts, and after this was found, new translations had to be made. In fact, at the end of the century, 2 important ones were made, the English Revised Version and the American Standard Version. We might look at the American Standard Version, made in 1901. The attempt was to maintain much of the beauty of the King James, but to make the language more accurate and plain. Thus it ends here, love suffereth long and is kind.
Let's see, this was 1901, but there were many discoveries after 1901.
Yes, remember the Chester Beatty Papyrus we looked at a while ago? That was in 1931, and due to that and other discoveries, we have our newest translations. Of these, the Revised Standard Version, published in 1952, is an outstanding example. Every effort has been made to bring this abreast of the finest scholarship and the best manuscript knowledge, and also to make the language as plain as possible. For example, it says simply, "If I give away all I have." The other one, just recently, is the New English Bible, just published in the New Testament. The Old Testament will come later.
1961.
A committee of English scholars has done this, again studying the ancient texts and considering modern language, perhaps in passages retaining a little bit of a British flavor, but giving us a wonderful translation. Note it, for example, "I may dole out all I possess," they say. And if I have no love, I am none the better.
I notice one thing here, my body to be burned or burnt, they retain the same configuration or the same interpretation as many of the others have.
Every translation we've looked at tonight has done that. There is one version that went back to that word that we saw in the papyrus and does have it the other way about giving our body to make a boast of it. But most of them, for reasons of the meaning, have thought it better to retain this translation.
And then we come to Confraternity, 1941.
This is the work of Roman Catholic scholars in our time. We saw in the newspaper very recently about the issuing of another book or two in the Old Testament version. The New Testament part was ready in 1941, and this is the text therein. We might simply notice that at the end we are still using that fine language that really derives all the way from the Vulgate long ago, but is the very best that can be said to bring the meaning, charity is patient, charity is kind.
Well, now, all of these new interpretations, these translations that go back to the original once again, what is happening now to the King James Version? Is that obsolete, and these other earlier translations?
No, not at all. As far as I'm concerned, it is very important to have these new translations. They give us accuracy, they give us clarity. We should use them for study and for reading. But as a reviewer has said now for 350 years, the King James Version has been one of the magnificent monuments of English literature, and I myself believe that it will be a favorite Bible of many people for many years to come.
Dr. Jack Finnegan, sir, we want to thank you for coming to Science in Action to tell us of the story of the Bible. Thank you, sir.